In a peaceful neighborhood nestled in the heart of Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, a young man named Liam Evans met a woman named Janya Thongsri. She had recently moved to the United States from Thailand, driven by the promise of a new life, and she found herself settling in a small town far from the bustling cityscapes she had known. Janya was full of hope, excitement, and an eagerness to begin this new chapter. The opportunity to build a better future in a foreign land where dreams could take root and grow had driven her across the world. She carried within her a quiet optimism, a desire for a life that was both her own and part of something larger, shared with someone who could understand and appreciate her journey. Liam was a 20-something-year-old man, unremarkable in many ways, but with a personality that easily connected with others. When he first met Janya, he was instantly captivated. There was something magnetic about her, something mysterious and exotic that drew him in. Her soft features, delicate smile, and the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about her dreams of the future, it all left him spellbound. Her story fascinated him. The idea of a woman from Thailand so far from her home, starting over in America, was an adventure in itself, and Liam found himself eager to learn more about her life, her culture, and the hopes she carried with her. Their connection was immediate. From their first conversation, they felt at ease with each other. They shared laughs over dinner, exchanged stories, and found comfort in the simple joy of being together. Over time, their bond deepened. What began as casual outings blossomed into something more, something that felt real and genuine. They spent months together, experiencing the little joys and struggles of life. They spent hours talking about their dreams of the future, of career success, of building a home filled with love. Liam loved hearing about Janya's journey from Thailand, how she had grown up in a small village, and the sacrifices she had made to pursue her education and a new life in America. He admired her resilience, her strength, and the courage it took to leave behind everything she knew for the possibility of something better. For Janya, Liam represented stability in a foreign land. His quiet confidence and grounded nature provided her with a sense of security that she hadn't realized she was missing. She had always been independent, but there was a warmth in Liam's presence that made her feel at home in a place that, at times, still felt foreign. She imagined a future with him, filled with possibilities, a future where they could support each other, grow together, and face the challenges that life would inevitably bring. As their relationship progressed, it became clear to both of them that they were building something special, something worth holding on to. They were a team, partners in a shared journey, and for the first time, Janya felt like she had found someone who truly understood her. However, as time passed, there were things neither of them could have anticipated. Beneath the surface of their blossoming romance, Janya was grappling with something deeply personal, something she had not yet fully confronted, even within herself. While her relationship with Liam had grown and flourished, Janya began to realize that there was an aspect of her identity that she had buried for many years. Growing up in Thailand, a culture where traditional gender roles and expectations were often rigid, Janya had never been able to openly explore her true self. She had lived much of her life in conflict, torn between the person she had been told to be and the person she felt she was deep inside. Janya had always known, on some level, that she was different. Even as a young girl, she had felt a sense of disconnection between her body and her inner self, but it was not something she could articulate. The pressure to conform to the expectations of society, to be the woman that others expected her to be, had always weighed heavily on her. As she grew older, she realized that her identity did not align with the gender she had been assigned at birth. She had always struggled with her feelings, trying to suppress them, to ignore the deep yearning for authenticity, but the realization had never been clearer than it was now. Living in the United States, in a place where freedom of expression was more accepted, and where, for the first time, she felt the possibility of truly being herself. Janya had begun her journey of self-discovery long before meeting Liam, but it wasn't until they had been together for some time that she felt ready to fully embrace who she was meant to be. She started researching, talking to others who had gone through similar experiences, and learning about the transgender community. She realized that she had always known deep inside that she was a woman, but she hadn't had the words or the support to express it. Hormone therapy seemed like a far-off dream, but in reality it was becoming a necessary step in her journey. This was not just about transitioning her body, it was about aligning her external world with her true self. As her feelings grew clearer, Janya felt both relief and fear. Relief because she was finally coming to terms with who she truly was. Fear because she knew that revealing this part of herself to Liam would be the hardest thing she had ever done. She loved him deeply, but she was terrified of how he might react. Would he understand? Would he accept her for who she was becoming? The thought of losing him, of having him reject her, was a constant source of anxiety. She was not just opening up about her gender identity, but also her sexual identity, the realization that she was a lesbian. Her attraction to women had always been a part of her, but it wasn't something she had explored in depth until now. It was another layer of herself that needed to be acknowledged, and she had no idea how Liam would feel about it. Despite her fears, Janya knew she could no longer hide this part of herself. The journey toward authenticity, while difficult, was necessary. She realized that she owed it to herself to be honest with Liam, to let him know the truth before it became an even bigger burden. She hoped that he would accept her, that he would understand the depth of her struggle, and that they could continue building their future together. A future where they could both live authentically and love freely. Little did she know, this revelation would change everything. Liam, for all his charm and open-mindedness, would soon be forced to confront his own fears, expectations, and feelings. What had seemed like a perfect relationship would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have predicted. But beneath the surface of their blossoming romance, there were things neither of them could have anticipated. Janya, like many people, had a journey of self-discovery ahead of her, and it was a journey that would eventually change the course of their lives forever. As their relationship blossomed, Janya felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She had finally left the confines of her small village in Thailand and was now in the United States, starting a new chapter of her life. She had found someone who genuinely seemed to care for her, someone who made her feel seen and heard. But deep down, she knew there was an aspect of herself she had yet to reveal to Liam. Despite their growing connection, a deep fear lingered in her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that if Liam truly knew her, all of her, he might not accept the person she was becoming. Janya had always known something was different about her. From a young age, she had felt a disconnect between her gender identity and the body she had been born into. But growing up in Thailand, a country with deeply ingrained traditional views on gender, she had learned to bury her feelings. The topic of gender identity was taboo, rarely spoken of in public spaces, and certainly not something young girls were encouraged to explore. She had grown up in a culture where gender roles were clearly defined and rigidly adhered to, and the idea of breaking from those norms was unthinkable. She spent years in silence, suppressing the feelings she had for fear of being rejected by her family, her community, and even by herself. But now, far away from her home in a foreign land, Janya felt a growing sense of urgency to face her truth. She had always admired the courage of others who were able to live as their authentic selves, and now she realized that she could no longer live in denial. She had reached a point in her life where the struggle to be someone she wasn't had become unbearable. She needed to be true to herself, regardless of the consequences. The thought of transitioning had always been in the back of her mind, but it wasn't until she had settled into her new life in Ohio, surrounded by new opportunities and a more accepting environment, that she felt empowered to take the first steps toward becoming the woman she had always been on the inside. Janya knew that this journey would not be easy. She would have to overcome the years of conditioning that told her that her feelings were wrong, that the woman she longed to be could never exist in the way society expected her to. The weight of the decision was immense, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. She began hormone therapy, the first step in her physical transition, and made appointments with doctors who specialized in gender-affirming care. It was a long, difficult process, but with each step, Janya felt a little more like herself. There was a sense of relief as her body began to reflect the woman she had always been. And for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of peace that had long eluded her. As Janya's transition progressed, she began to grapple with the reality of revealing this part of herself to Liam. She had kept this secret from him for months, and the guilt of not being completely honest with him weighed heavily on her. She had always prided herself on being open with him about everything else, but this truth felt too big, too frightening to share. Would Liam understand? Would he accept her? Or would he reject her, turning away from her because she had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated? The uncertainty gnawed at her every day. But despite the fear, Janya knew that the time had come to be honest. She couldn't continue to live a life of half-truths, especially not with someone she cared for so deeply. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Janya decided it was time to have the conversation. She had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times, but now, standing before Liam, the words felt too heavy to say out loud. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to finally speak her truth. Janya told Liam that she had been undergoing hormone therapy and was in the process of transitioning. She explained to him that for most of her life she had felt trapped in a body that didn't align with who she was on the inside. She shared how she had always known that she was a woman, but it wasn't until she came to the United States that she had the courage to begin transitioning. Her voice shook as she revealed that she had embraced her identity as a transgender woman, and that she had finally come to terms with the fact that she was attracted to women, which meant that she identified as a lesbian. As Janya spoke, she watched Liam's face closely, searching for any sign of understanding or acceptance. The silence that followed felt deafening, and the weight of her vulnerability hung in the air between them. She had hoped that Liam would accept her, that he would understand the difficult journey she had been on, but instead, she saw something different in his eyes. The shock was palpable, and she could see his mind working furiously, trying to process what she had just told him. His expression shifted from confusion to something else, something darker. Liam was not the open-minded, understanding man she had thought he was. The more Janya spoke, the more his face contorted with disbelief. His initial reaction was not one of acceptance, but one of frustration, confusion, and even anger. His world, the world that had seemed so stable and predictable, was now in upheaval. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he thought he understood, would change in such a way. He couldn't make sense of it. The woman he had known was now telling him that she was someone entirely different. It was too much for him to process all at once. The words that came next were harsh, filled with emotions that Janya had not anticipated. Liam's anger erupted, and the warmth they had once shared seemed to vanish in an instant. He couldn't understand why Janya hadn't told him sooner, why she hadn't been honest with him from the beginning. He felt betrayed, as though the woman he loved was now a stranger. His inability to reconcile her truth with his own feelings of love and ownership over their relationship became a point of deep conflict between them. Janya, stunned by his reaction, tried to explain herself further, to show him the pain and confusion she had lived with for so long. But it was clear that Liam was not listening. His emotions had clouded his judgment, and he couldn't hear her words over the noise of his own anger and fear. The conversation quickly spiraled into a fight, one that neither of them could control. For Janya, the hope she had once had that Liam would understand and accept her began to slip away. She realized that the love they had shared was not enough to overcome the deep-seated discomfort and confusion Liam felt about her identity. What she had hoped would be a moment of connection turned into a chasm, one that widened with every word. The man she had trusted, the person she had opened up to, was no longer the person she had thought he was. The rejection was crushing, but it also opened her eyes to the truth. Some people are not ready to accept others for who they truly are, no matter how much love is shared between them. Janya had hoped for understanding, but instead she was met with rejection. The pain of that moment, of seeing Liam's anger and confusion, would stay with her forever. She realized that she could no longer rely on the love of someone who was unable to accept her as she truly was. Liam, who had never suspected that Janya was anything other than the woman he had fallen in love with, was shocked and confused by her revelation. The woman he had known, the woman he had loved, was now someone he couldn't fully understand. His initial confusion quickly turned into anger. He felt betrayed, as though the woman he thought he had built a future with was no longer the same person. Liam didn't know how to handle the situation. His feelings of being deceived overwhelmed him, and he couldn't see past his own frustration and resentment. The more Janya explained her journey, the more Liam's anger grew. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had known with the person she was becoming. He struggled with the idea that the woman he loved, was now living as someone else, someone he didn't recognize. This struggle with acceptance quickly escalated into something darker, something he couldn't control. Liam had always believed that the relationship he and Janya shared was one built on mutual understanding, trust, and love. They had spent countless hours together, sharing their hopes, their dreams, and their vision of the future. He had never suspected that there was anything beneath the surface of Janya's identity that she had been hiding from him. She was the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had filled his life with joy and excitement. Her laughter, her kindness, and the way she made him feel whole, these were the things that had drawn him to her, and he had thought they were enough to build a lasting relationship. But when Janya revealed to him the truth about her transition, the foundation of their relationship seemed to crack in an instant. The woman he had loved, the woman he had seen as his partner for life, was now someone he didn't fully understand. The revelation was a shock to him, something he had never prepared for, and it left him reeling. The idea that the person he thought he knew so well was now living a life that didn't align with the image he had in his mind was something Liam struggled to process. The woman who had once been so familiar to him had transformed into someone he no longer recognized, and he felt as though he had been blindsided by the truth. Initially, Liam's reaction was one of confusion. He couldn't make sense of it. He tried to understand what Janya was telling him, but the words she spoke felt like a blur, and they didn't match the version of her he had come to know. How could she have been hiding this from him? Why hadn't she told him sooner? His mind raced with questions, but each answer only seemed to add to his confusion. He felt betrayed by the very woman he had trusted most. The life they had planned together, the dreams they had shared, all seemed to collapse under the weight of this new reality. As the shock of the situation began to fade, Liam's confusion quickly gave way to anger. The feelings of betrayal that had first begun as a dull ache now transformed into something much darker. He felt as though Janya had taken something from him, something he couldn't easily put into words, but something that felt as if it had been stolen. He had built a future with her in his mind, and now that future seemed to be slipping away. The vision of the life they would share, the plans they had made, the quiet moments they had imagined, felt like lies. The woman he had thought he knew, the woman he had loved, was no longer the person he had imagined. Liam's anger grew with every passing second, every new revelation that Janya shared. As she explained her journey of self-discovery and the steps she had taken toward living as her true self, Liam's mind couldn't keep up. He heard the words, but he couldn't fully absorb their meaning. He couldn't understand how Janya could have lived this way without telling him, without sharing this part of herself with him earlier in their relationship. To him, it felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. He had always prided himself on being open-minded, but now he found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions that he couldn't control. He felt as though he had been made to look foolish, as though the trust he had placed in Janya was misplaced. The more Janya explained her transition, the more Liam's anger intensified. He struggled to reconcile the person she was becoming with the person he had once known. The woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had seemed so sure of herself, was now a stranger in his eyes. He couldn't understand why Janya hadn't been honest with him from the start, why she had kept this hidden for so long. Every explanation she gave only seemed to make the situation more complicated. His frustration mounted, and he found himself lost in a sea of resentment, unable to see past the hurt he felt. As the conversation dragged on, the anger Liam felt toward Janya became consuming. He couldn't control the rage that had taken over him. He had always thought of himself as someone who could talk through problems, who could work things out with the people he cared about. But this was something he couldn't wrap his mind around. The woman he had shared his life with, the one he had loved, was now someone he didn't recognize. He couldn't accept it, he couldn't understand it, and as much as Janya tried to explain herself, Liam's mind was too clouded with anger to hear her. The idea that Janya was transitioning, that she had already begun to live as her true self, was something Liam could not fathom. To him, it felt like a threat to everything he had known. The foundation of their relationship was built on a shared sense of identity, and now that identity seemed to be crumbling before him. He couldn't handle the realization that the woman he had imagined spending his future with was changing into someone he didn't understand. And with that feeling of confusion and betrayal came a deeper, more primal emotion: fear. He was scared. Scared that this change would rip apart everything he had known. Scared that he was losing something that was precious to him. And in his fear, his anger only grew. Liam tried to push past the confusion, tried to find some way to reconcile the woman he had known with the person she was becoming. But the more he tried, the more the gap between them seemed to widen. He couldn't see a way forward. His feelings of betrayal overwhelmed him, drowning out any empathy he might have felt for Janya's struggle. He was consumed by resentment, by the overwhelming sense that everything he had built with her had been a lie. And in that moment, when the woman he loved seemed so far removed from the person he had known, he found himself trapped in a storm of emotions that he didn't know how to control. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface erupted with force. What began as confusion and disbelief spiraled into something darker, something that Liam couldn't contain. His inability to accept Janya's transition, coupled with his growing frustration, led him down a path that he would never be able to undo. In that moment of uncontrolled rage, everything changed. The man he had been, the person who had shared his life with Janya, was no longer the same. The anger, the betrayal, and the confusion had taken over, leaving no room for understanding or compassion. What had started as a relationship full of hope and love was now teetering on the edge of something far darker, something neither of them could have anticipated. Janya had hoped for acceptance, for understanding, but in the face of Liam's anger, all she found was rejection. The person she had trusted the most, the person she had believed would stand by her, was now the one who felt the most distant, and as the emotional distance between them grew, so did the devastating consequences of Liam's inability to accept the truth about the woman he had loved. After the violent act, Liam stood in the center of the room, frozen, as the realization of what he had done slowly started to sink in. His breath came in shallow, erratic gasps, his chest tightening with each inhale. The overwhelming adrenaline that had fueled his rage now began to dissipate, leaving behind an oppressive emptiness. He looked down at the floor, where the blood had already begun to pool, darkening the once cleanly surface of the room. The vibrant life that had been Janya, the woman who had once brought warmth and joy into his life, was now gone. The woman he had loved, the person he had imagined a future with, was no longer there. All that remained was her lifeless body, a testament to the violence that had erupted in a moment of confusion, fear, and resentment. The bloodstains on the floor seemed to mock him, their deep crimson color serving as a cruel reminder of the irreversible act he had just committed. Each drop, each smear on the carpet was a permanent fixture that could never be erased. His mind, which had been clouded with rage moments before, was now a torrent of disbelief. How had things escalated so quickly? How had he allowed his anger to control him so completely? He hadn't meant to kill her. He hadn't meant for this to happen, but it had, and the consequences of his actions were now all too real. There was no undoing it, no erasing the horror he had inflicted. Liam stumbled back, his hands trembling as they hung uselessly at his sides. His head swam with confusion, the events of the past few minutes replaying in fragmented flashes. He could still hear the sharp cries of pain, could still see the terror in Janya's eyes before they dulled with death. He had been so consumed by his own inability to accept her transformation, to accept who she had become, that he had lashed out in the most extreme way possible. Now, standing in the aftermath, Liam could barely comprehend what he had done. There was no anger left, only a cold, hollow emptiness that filled him entirely. He was overwhelmed by the weight of his actions, and it felt as though his very soul had been shattered by the violence he had unleashed. Minutes, or perhaps hours later, the sound of sirens broke through the thick silence in the room. The police had been alerted by neighbors who had heard the commotion, the raised voices, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, the silence that followed. The neighbors, too shocked and unsure of what was happening, had called the authorities, fearing that something terrible was unfolding within the confines of the Martin household. Liam could barely hear the sirens over the rushing in his ears, the dizziness that came from the shock of his own actions. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, or if there was anything left to say. He felt trapped in his own mind, in the reality of what had just occurred. When the police arrived, Liam didn't fight. He didn't resist. His body was stiff with a kind of numbness, as if he were already disconnected from the world around him. The officers entered the house, their movements swift and practiced, and it didn't take long for them to assess the scene. The blood, the body, the knife still on the floor. The details painted a clear and gruesome picture. They immediately understood that this was not a case of self-defense, nor a tragic accident. This was a murder, driven by something far more complex than a simple argument. Liam didn't speak at first. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. He had no defense, no justification for his actions. He had been so consumed by his own rage, by his own inability to accept the changes in Janya, that he had lost control. And now, standing there in front of the police, he had no words. His confusion, his shock, his guilt, all of it was too much to process in that moment. He was arrested without resistance, led away in handcuffs, his mind spinning with thoughts he couldn't grasp. His world, once filled with love and possibilities, had collapsed in an instant, and now he was left to face the consequences of his blind rage. As the police investigated the scene, it became clear that the motive behind the attack was rooted in Liam's struggle with Janya's identity. The more they learned about their relationship, the more they uncovered the deep-seated resentment that had festered within him. Janya's transition had been the catalyst for the violence, but the truth was that Liam had never truly accepted her for who she was. He had never fully understood her journey, and as she began to embrace her true self, it challenged the very foundation of their relationship. The realization that she was a transgender woman, that she was living her life as someone else, shattered Liam's perception of her and their future together. Janya had hoped, despite everything, that Liam would eventually come to accept her. She had believed, perhaps naively, that their love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Liam's inability to accept her for who she had become, not just as a transgender woman, but as a person who had embraced her truth and her identity as a lesbian, was the very thing that had driven him to violence. His fear, his confusion, and his sense of betrayal led to the brutal murder of the woman he had once loved. The details of the crime shocked everyone who knew them. To those on the outside, Liam and Janya had seemed like a couple destined for success. They had been young, hopeful, and full of potential, but beneath the surface there had always been tension. Liam had struggled with Janya's transformation, but he had never expressed it fully until that moment. His inability to reconcile the woman she had been with the person she was becoming left him trapped in his own frustration, unable to see the humanity in her journey. Janya's murder was not just an act of violence, it was the tragic consequence of a lack of understanding, of acceptance, and of love that had been overshadowed by fear and resentment. What had once seemed like a love story full of promise had ended in a brutal act of senseless violence. The woman who had been in the midst of a deeply personal and difficult journey was now gone, her life cut short by the very person who had once promised to protect and care for her. And for Liam, the consequences of that moment of rage would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman he had loved was lost, and there would be no way to undo what he had done. As the authorities continued their investigation and Liam was taken into custody, the weight of the tragedy began to settle over the small community. What had once seemed like a promising relationship had ended in the most tragic of ways. Janya's death would serve as a painful reminder of the dangers of intolerance, of the lack of acceptance that so often surrounds those who are different. And for Liam, the regret and guilt of his actions would be something he would carry for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of how far he had let his anger and confusion take him. The trial that followed was one of profound sorrow, and it became a painful reminder of the dangers of intolerance and the inability to accept someone for who they truly are. The courtroom was filled with tense silence as each side presented its case, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in a quiet home in Ohio. Janya, a young woman full of dreams and hopes for the future, had been on the path of self-discovery. She had taken the courageous steps to live her life authentically, transitioning into the woman she had always felt she was on the inside. She had worked hard to embrace her true identity, to shed the layers of doubt and fear that had once weighed heavily on her. But in the very place where she had hoped to find love and acceptance, She had found rejection, anger, and violence instead. Liam Evans, the man who had once been the person she thought she could build a life with, had failed to understand her, to see the person she had become. Instead of offering support, empathy, or even an attempt to understand her journey, he had let his frustration and confusion fester. He had been unable to cope with the change, unable to accept the transformation that was both physical and emotional. In his mind, the woman he had loved no longer existed, and in that loss, he had allowed his emotions to override any semblance of understanding or compassion. His inability to handle his emotions, his confusion and resentment, coupled with his refusal to accept Janya's transformation, had ultimately led to an irreversible tragedy. The case against Liam was clear. The evidence was overwhelming, and the details of the crime were shocking. The murder was not committed in a moment of self-defense or in a fit of panic. It was an act of violence born from deep-seated confusion, anger, and rejection. Liam's failure to communicate, to seek help, and to understand his own feelings led to an explosion of violence. In a fit of blind rage, he had taken the life of the woman who had once been the center of his world. Janya's death was a result of his inability to reconcile his own discomfort with her transition and his complete failure to comprehend the love and vulnerability that Janya had placed in their relationship. As the trial went on, the courtroom was a stark reminder of the deep emotional wounds that had been inflicted, not just on Janya but on everyone who had known her. The prosecutors painted a clear picture of a young woman trying to navigate her identity in a world that often rejected those who were different. Janya had struggled with her sense of self for years before she made the decision to transition. She had lived in a country where cultural norms made it difficult to embrace such a personal truth, where gender roles were rigidly defined, and the idea of a transgender person was far from widely accepted. She had fought against her own fears and insecurities, against the deep-rooted prejudice of her community in order to live authentically. But in the end, it was the one person she had trusted the most, the one person she had hoped would understand her, who betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. The defense, while acknowledging Liam's emotional distress, could not deny the facts. His failure to control his emotions, to seek understanding, and to deal with his confusion in a healthy way had resulted in a senseless act of violence. Janya's friends and family were left to mourn not only the loss of a daughter, a sister, and a friend, but the loss of a young woman who had been full of potential and dreams. She had been on the path to creating a life for herself in the United States, a life where she could be who she truly was. Without fear or shame, she had hoped to find love, acceptance, and happiness, things that every person deserves, regardless of their gender identity. But instead, her journey had been cut short by the very person who was supposed to love and protect her. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Liam's actions were not just the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. They were the culmination of deep-seated prejudice and an inability to accept the person Janya had become. The tragedy was not just the result of a relationship gone wrong. It was the result of a society's unwillingness to accept those who are different. It was a reminder of the harsh realities that transgender individuals face every day, the rejection, the isolation, and the constant battle to be seen as their true selves. The violent death of Janya was not just a personal tragedy for those who loved her. It was a reflection of a much larger issue that extends far beyond one relationship. It served as a painful reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice and intolerance can affect the lives of those who are simply trying to live authentically. Janya had not asked for anything more than the ability to be herself. Yet the world had responded with violence and rejection. In a time when acceptance and understanding were so desperately needed, the consequences of Liam's actions were devastating. The trial and the ensuing conviction underscored the importance of understanding, acceptance, and empathy in relationships. These were qualities that Liam had failed to exhibit when faced with Janya's truth. His anger, frustration, and inability to cope with the changes in his life had clouded his judgment and led to a senseless act of violence. The tragedy of Janya's death was a stark reminder of how crucial it is to foster empathy and open-mindedness in relationships, especially when faced with something as deeply personal as gender identity. This heartbreaking story serves as a tragic reminder of the immense cost of intolerance, It speaks to the need for open dialogue, the need for support systems that encourage acceptance and understanding, and the importance of allowing people to live as their true selves without fear of violence or rejection. The loss of Janya, a young woman who had so much potential, is a painful reflection of the consequences of deep-seated prejudice and unaddressed emotion. In the end, this is not just a story of a love gone wrong. It is a story of lost potential, of a future that was stolen from Janya in the most violent way possible. The ripple effect of this tragedy will be felt by those who knew and loved Janya for years to come. Her friends and family will forever remember the vibrant, strong woman she was, the person who had fought so hard to be herself, to live authentically in a world that was often unkind to people like her. They will remember the love she brought into their lives, the laughter, the joy, and the warmth, and they will also carry the weight of the knowledge that her life was taken from her too soon by someone who couldn't accept her for who she was. The consequences of Liam's actions are irreversible. His guilt will haunt him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the anger and confusion that led to the loss of someone who had once meant everything to him. In the end, there is no resolution to this tragedy, no happy ending, no forgiveness, just a life cut short, a love turned deadly, and a world left to reckon with the costs of intolerance and hate.